Assalamu alaikum viewers. Today we are going to learn about a play, A Doll's House, written by Henrick Ibsen. So firstly we will discuss the characters of this play. So let's get started. So firstly we are going to talk about the major characters which are there in the play. First one is Noora. Noora is the protagonist in this play, and she is basically the wife of Torvald Helmer. The second character is Torvald Helmer. He is the husband of Noora, and he is bank manager in a bank. Firstly, he was a lawyer, then he shifted his career as a banker. Now, the next character is Krogstad. He is basically a villain in this drama. Then comes Mrs. Christine. Who is Mrs. Christine? Basically, she is friend of Noora, a childhood friend of Noora. And then comes Dr. Rink. Who is the Dr. Rink? Basically, he is the family friend of the Noora and Torvald Helmer. So now we are moving towards the summary of the doll's house. So here we are having some points. So what happens in the starting of the play, like Noora enters house, she comes back from the shopping for the Christmas celebration. So we can see that Noora is entering her house, and because Christmas is about to arrive soon, so she comes back after doing the shopping for the Christmas. And her husband was there. Her husband Torvald Helmer calls her spendthrift because Noora, she spends a lot of money, and due to the reason, her husband Torvald Helmer calls her a spendthrift. He calls her with the different names, my little skylark, my squirrel, my sparrow, to show that as a human she is weak. So basically, like we can see that like in 19th century society in which this play was written by Henrick Ibsen. So in that era, like we can see that women were considered as a weak and male were considered as a strong and dominant. Due to the reason, we can see that here what Tormer Harmer want to represent. He wants to represent that he is having authority, he is the head, and as a man he is more strong. And the Noora, she is weak, so he is calling her with the name because these animals are very small and very weak. We can see like skylark, squirrel, sparrow. These are weak creatures, so he's comparing basically his wife with these little or weak creatures. After some days, Nora's friend Mrs. Christine visits her house and tells her she needs a job. Then what happens that Nora tells her friend that her husband Torvald Halmer is now on a promotion in his bank and having a good salary. She will talk to him to give her a job in his bank. So what happens that Noura's friend Mrs. Christine, she comes to visit Noura, and she tells the Noura that she is finding a job, and it would be better that if find a job in a bank where Noura's husband is working. So Noura tells her friend that her husband is already on the promotion, so his salary would be good and he's having good position, so she would talk to her husband about this, and definitely she would be helping her to find a job. Noura further adds how she took the borrow few years back from a person namely Krogstad, and due to the reason she could save her husband from the illness. So basically what happens here, like in this point, like the Noura's husband Torvald Halmer, he was very sick in the past years, and the doctor suggested to Noura that you should take your husband in a country like Italy, and if you would take your husband there, then your husband illness would be removed or he will recover soon. So at that time, Noura, she borrows the money from a person namely Krogstad, and she hides this truth that she borrowed the money from Crockstead, and instead she lies that she took the money from her father. Now, moving on further points, she further says that her husband Torvald is not aware about it, that she took borrow from the Crockstead. Instead, she lied to her husband that money she borrowed from her father. After a few time, Crockstead comes and he blackmails Noora that he is about to be expelled from the job by Torvald. If he does so, he would tell her husband truth that money which Noora borrowed was actually from him. So what happens that the Crockstead from whom Noora borrowed the money in the past, he is also aware that the Noora uh, told a lie from Noora told a lie from her husband in the past. So that's why we can see that um we can see that Crockstead he starts blackmailing Noora. So now moving towards another slide, Noora becomes worried. Noora becomes worried because Crockstead is continuously blackmailing the Noora, and the Noora is worried that if like this truth would become in front of her husband, then what would be her husband's reaction? Maybe her marriage would be um, in danger. So Noora tries to make Crockstead understand, but he refused. Crockstead and Mrs. Christine were in relationship in the past, but the Mrs. Christine married to someone else. Now she was a widow as her husband died. So what happens that in the past time, Crockstead and Mrs. Christine, she and Crockstead, they were having a relationship and they were about to marry. But what happens that like Mrs. Christine, she married someone else, and after marriage maybe her husband died and she becomes widow, so she was single again. So now Crockstead and Mrs. Christine start their relationship again and they thought they would marry. So moving towards next slide, that Crockstead leaves a letter in Nora's house letter box. That what happens that the Crocksteads leaves a letter in a letter box which was there in inside of the house of Nora, and Nora comes to know then she tries to distract her husband in many ways. So Nora she becomes aware that Crockstead has leave a letter about the reality of borrowing the money. So she tries to distract her husband so he could not read that letter and would not become aware about the reality. So by doing this, she could save like her marriage. So finally, Helmer receives the letter and comes to know about reality. He yelled at Noora, means Torvald Helmer, he yelled and scolded at Noora for hiding the truth and insults her. Noora also says some emotional words. Then she says she would never live with him now. She is going away from him and from kids and will never come back. She leaves the house and here the story ends. So what happens that when Torvald Helmer he reads the letter, then he comes to know that how Noora told lie in the past, and the money she borrowed was not actually from the Noura's father, but it was actually from the Crockstead, and Crockstead is already a ill-reputed person. So he becomes very angry at Noora. He yelled at her, and what happened that Noora she says emotional words in front of her husband, and she says that she would never live with him anymore and she is going away from there, and now she would find a name for her and find a recognition. Then here the story ends and Noora leaves her house. So that's all.